A millionaire gives a homeless woman shelter in exchange for tutoring his troubled son. What begins as a simple arrangement soon transforms their lives in ways none of them could have imagined. As the boy flourishes under her care, the father finds himself questioning everything he thought he knew about success, love, and family. The city buzzed with the ceaseless hum of ambition, its skyline glittering against the twilight. Among the sea of glass towers stood one that dwarfed the rest, the headquarters of Cross Industries. Inside, the air was cool and sterile, dominated by muted tones and the quiet hum of efficiency. At its apex, in an office with a view that could silence anyone, Ethan Cross leaned back in his leather chair, a man who wore success like armor. Tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, Ethan was the picture of control. His dark hair, streaked with silver at the temples, framed piercing blue eyes that rarely softened. His reputation as a shrewd businessman preceded him, but those who worked with him whispered of something else, a man cold and distant, untouchable even by those closest to him. It was nearing 9 p.m. when he finally loosened his tie and stepped away from his desk. The sprawling office felt empty, though the hum of activity on the floors below continued. Ethan descended to the lobby, his polished leather shoes clicking against the marble floor, echoing in the vast space. The night air greeted him like a slap, crisp and biting, as he stepped outside and adjusted his coat. For a moment, he stood at the edge of the bustling street, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something he couldn't name. That's when he noticed her. Across the street, beneath the flickering glow of a broken streetlight, a woman crouched beside a young boy. She wasn't begging or asking for help. Instead, she spoke softly to him, her voice carrying over the noise of passing cars. Ethan squinted, trying to make out the details. The woman, though clad in a threadbare coat and scarf, held herself with a kind of poise that seemed almost defiant of her surroundings. Beside her was a battered suitcase, and in her hand, she clutched a book. "Come on, try again," she urged gently, her tone warm but insistent. The boy sniffled and wiped at his nose with the back of his sleeve. He couldn't have been older than 8 or 9. His clothes were too big for his small frame, and his cheeks were flushed pink from the cold. "I can't," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yes, you can," the woman replied, her voice firm now. "Look at me. You've got this." Something about her tone struck Ethan. It wasn't pity. It wasn't charity. It was belief, pure and simple. He stood frozen on the curb, watching as the boy reluctantly took the book and began to read, stumbling over the words but trying nonetheless. When he finally managed to string together a full sentence, the woman smiled. A real, genuine smile that softened the hard lines of her face. "See? I knew you could do it." Ethan wasn't sure what compelled him, but he crossed the street. The closer he got, the clearer her features became. Auburn hair peeked out from beneath her scarf, and her face, though tired, held an intelligence that shone brightly in her sharp, hazel eyes. She looked up as he approached, her expression shifting from warmth to wary determination. "Is there something I can help you with?" she asked, standing and placing herself protectively in front of the boy. Ethan stopped a few feet away, his hands in his coat pockets. He wasn't used to being addressed so directly, especially not by someone like her, someone whose circumstances should have made her timid or deferential. Instead, she met his gaze head-on, unflinching. "I couldn't help but notice," he began, his voice even. "You seem to be good with children." The boy clutched the book tighter, glancing nervously between the two adults. The woman tilted her head slightly, studying Ethan as if trying to discern his intentions. "I'm a teacher," she said simply. "At least I was." Her voice was tinged with quiet pride, despite the clear challenges she faced. Ethan's curiosity deepened. "What happened?" "Life," she said with a wry smile. Things didn't go as planned. Her honesty caught him off guard. Most people he encountered would spin a narrative to garner sympathy or respect, but she offered none of that. She simply was, unapologetic and self-assured, even in the face of adversity. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone softening. "Grace Porter," she replied, her chin lifting slightly. "Why?" Ethan hesitated for a beat, considering his next words. He thought of Jack, his son, who had been spiraling further into rebellion and isolation. Tutors had come and gone, each more expensive and credentialed than the last, yet none had managed to break through the walls Jack had built. Watching Grace with the boy reminded Ethan of something he hadn't seen in years: patience, compassion, belief. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Porter," he said, slipping back into the decisive cadence of a businessman. "Come work for me. Teach my son. In return, I'll provide you with a place to stay and a fair wage." Grace blinked, her expression shifting from guarded to incredulous. "You're serious?" "Very." She crossed her arms, her gaze narrowing. "And what makes you think I'd accept?" Ethan smirked, though it lacked the coldness that usually accompanied his expressions. "You're clearly overqualified to be out here. I'm offering you a chance to do what you're good at, what you love." She didn't respond right away, her eyes drifting to the boy beside her, who had resumed reading quietly. Ethan could see the wheels turning in her mind, weighing the risk against the opportunity. Finally, she met his gaze again. "What's the catch?" she asked, her tone laced with suspicion. "No catch," he replied evenly. "Just results." Grace regarded him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she nodded once, a small but decisive gesture. "All right, I'll do it." Ethan extended his hand, and she took it. Her grip was firm, her gaze steady. As they shook hands, Ethan felt an unfamiliar twinge of something he couldn't quite name. Relief? Hope? He wasn't sure. "Good," he said, releasing her hand. "We'll start tomorrow." As Ethan turned to leave, Grace called out after him. "You didn't say your name." He glanced over his shoulder, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Ethan Cross." The following morning, the first rays of sunlight streamed through the towering glass windows of the Cross mansion, illuminating its cold, immaculate interiors. The house, perched on a hill that overlooked the sprawling city, was an architectural marvel of sharp edges and modernity. Yet, despite its grandeur, it exuded an eerie emptiness, as if warmth and life had been vacuumed out in favor of sterile perfection. Ethan Cross stood in the expansive living room, coffee cup in hand, scanning the day's financial news on his tablet. His tailored shirt was crisp, his hair meticulously combed, every detail of his appearance controlled and deliberate. He was a man who thrived on predictability, yet today, the prospect of introducing a stranger into his home, a stranger with no resume, no formal references, unsettled him more than he cared to admit. A knock at the door broke his focus. He glanced at his watch. Punctual. That was a good start. When he opened the door, Grace Porter stood there, suitcase in hand, wearing the same coat she had the previous night. Despite her modest appearance, there was a quiet confidence in her stance. She wasn't intimidated by the grandiose facade or the man who owned it. "Good morning, Mr. Cross," she said, her voice steady. Her hazel eyes darted briefly past him, taking in the cavernous hallway behind him. She didn't linger on the marble floors or the glittering chandelier above. She looked, instead, for signs of life. "Grace," Ethan said with a nod, stepping aside to let her in. "Come in." She stepped through the threshold, her boots making soft clicks against the polished floor. For a moment, she paused, her gaze lingering on a large family portrait hanging by the staircase. In the photo, Ethan stood stiffly beside a woman with kind eyes and a radiant smile, their young son between them. The woman's hand rested lightly on Ethan's arm, as if she was holding him in place. Grace tilted her head slightly, then turned to face Ethan. "You have a beautiful home," she said, her tone neutral. Ethan gestured toward the hallway. "I'll show you to your quarters." The guest house was detached from the main residence, accessible through a garden path lined with meticulously trimmed hedges. As they walked, Ethan explained the arrangement in clipped, efficient sentences. "The housekeeper, Anna, will deliver meals. You'll have full access to the guest house facilities. Your primary responsibility is my son, Jack. He's 10. I expect you to help him improve academically, but also discipline-wise." "Discipline?" Grace echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," Ethan said, his jaw tightening. "He's been difficult." Grace didn't press further. She understood what he wasn't saying. Jack wasn't just difficult, he was lost. They reached the guest house, a sleek structure with large windows and minimalist decor. Ethan pushed the door open, revealing a cozy interior, plush furniture, a small kitchen, and a bedroom tucked away behind sliding doors. Grace set her suitcase down by the door. "This will do just fine," she said, giving him a small nod of approval. "Thank you." Ethan glanced at her, searching for any sign of hesitation or discomfort. Instead, she was calm, composed, entirely unflustered by the sudden upheaval of her circumstances. He found it both reassuring and unnerving. "I'll let you settle in," he said. "You'll meet Jack after breakfast." The dining room was eerily silent when Grace entered. Jack sat at one end of the long table, hunched over a plate of untouched eggs and toast. He was small for his age, with a mop of dark hair that fell into his eyes. His shoulders were hunched, his expression a mixture of boredom and defiance. Ethan stood near the window, speaking into his phone in hushed tones. When he saw Grace enter, he ended the call abruptly. "Jack," he said, his voice sharp, "this is Miss Porter. She'll be your tutor." Jack didn't look up. He poked at his eggs with a fork, muttering something under his breath. Grace walked over to the table, her steps unhurried. She pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "Hi, Jack," she said, her tone light. "It's nice to meet you." Jack finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as he sized her up. "Are you a teacher?" "I am," Grace replied, meeting his gaze. "And I hear you're pretty smart." The boy snorted, slumping further into his chair. "I don't need a teacher. I've already had, like, 5. They all quit." "Did they?" Grace said, her expression neutral. "Why do you think that is?" Jack shrugged, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, defiance, but also a trace of vulnerability. "Maybe they weren't the right fit," Grace continued, leaning back in her chair. "But I'm not them. So why don't we start fresh?" Jack studied her for a moment, clearly uncertain. Ethan, who had been watching the interaction from the sidelines, cleared his throat. "Jack," he said, his tone firm, "Miss Porter is here to help you. You will listen to her." "Or what?" Jack shot back, glaring at his father. The tension in the room was palpable. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Grace held up a hand. "It's okay," she said calmly. "Jack and I will figure it out." She turned her attention back to the boy. "How about this? We'll start with something simple. You tell me one thing you're good at, and I'll tell you one thing I'm good at." Jack frowned, caught off guard by the question. He picked at his toast, avoiding her gaze. Finally, he muttered, "I'm good at soccer." "Soccer?" Grace repeated with a nod. "Nice. I'm good at cooking." Jack glanced at her, curious despite himself. "What kind of cooking?" "Oh, all kinds," Grace said with a grin. "But my best dish is pancakes. Maybe, if we survive our first week together, I'll make you some." Jack's lips twitched as if he wanted to smile but didn't dare. Grace noticed but didn't push him. She stood and picked up her plate. "Well, I'd better get ready for our first lesson," she said. "Meet me in the library in 15 minutes. Jack watched her leave, his expression unreadable. Ethan, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, walked over and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Give her a chance," he said quietly. "She's different." Jack shrugged off his father's hand and stood, shoving his chair back. "We'll see." As Jack trudged toward the library, Ethan lingered in the dining room, staring after him. For the first time in years, a flicker of hope stirred within him. Hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The Cross Mansion's library was as grand as any in a European estate. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with leather-bound books, rolling ladder to reach the higher volumes, and an antique globe in one corner that seemed to spin just for effect. But the grandeur was lost on Jack. He sat slouched in a high-backed chair, a pencil spinning idly between his fingers, while Grace Porter arranged a stack of workbooks on the polished oak desk. "Let's set some ground rules," Grace began, her tone calm but firm. She stood on the opposite side of the desk, meeting Jack's sulky gaze head-on. "First, I'm not here to make your life miserable. I'm here to help you. But if you're going to waste my time, I'll pack my bags and leave. Deal?" Jack blinked, startled by her candor. He was used to adults circling around him with forced cheer or outright frustration. This was new territory. "Okay," he muttered, more out of surprise than agreement. "Second," Grace continued, "I'll treat you with respect, and I expect the same in return. That means no sarcasm, no eye-rolling, and definitely no throwing things." "Got it." Jack's lips twitched into a reluctant smirk. "No promises." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Third," she said, her voice softening just slightly, "I want you to tell me the truth. If you're frustrated, if you don't understand something, if you hate my guts, say it. Deal?" Jack tilted his head, considering her. Finally, he gave a small nod. "Deal. Good." Grace slid one of the workbooks across the desk. "Let's start with something easy, math," Jack groaned, slumping lower in his chair. "Math isn't easy. It is when I'm teaching it," Grace said, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. She flipped the workbook open to a section on basic fractions. "Let's see what you know." For the first 30 minutes, Jack was a study in resistance. He answered in monosyllables, scribbled half-heartedly in the margins of his workbook, and refused to make eye contact. But Grace remained unflappable. She asked questions patiently, explained concepts in simple terms, and praised him for even the smallest effort. "Okay, imagine this," she said, tapping the page with her pen. "You have a pizza, 8 slices. You eat 2. What fraction of the pizza is left?" Jack squinted at the page, then at her. 6 out of 8? "Close," Grace said. "Now simplify it. What's 6 divided by 2? Jack hesitated, his brow furrowing. 3. Right. And 8 divided by 2? 4. So the fraction is 3/4, Grace said, writing it neatly on the page. "See? You're better at this than you think." Jack stared at the numbers, a small crease forming between his eyebrows. For a moment, he looked almost pleased with himself. Then he caught her watching him and quickly masked it with a shrug. "Whatever. It's just pizza." Grace chuckled. "Sure it is." By the end of the session, Jack had completed 3 pages of problems, more than Grace had expected. She didn't mention this to him, though. She could sense his fragile pride and didn't want to push too hard. Instead, she gathered up the workbooks and gave him a small, approving nod. "Good work today," she said. "Same time tomorrow?" Jack hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." As he left the library, Grace allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She knew it was just a small step, but with Jack, every inch of progress felt like a mile. Later that evening, Grace was in the guest house unpacking her books when there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Ethan standing there, his expression unreadable. "How did it go?" he asked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. His presence seemed to shrink the small living room. "Better than I expected," Grace said, folding her arms. "He's bright. Stubborn, but bright." Ethan gave a short laugh, though there was little humor in it. "That's an understatement." Grace studied him for a moment. "He's also lonely," she said softly. Ethan stiffened. "What do you mean?" "I mean he feels like no one listens to him," Grace said, her tone careful but firm. "He's acting out because he doesn't know how else to get attention." Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering with something Grace couldn't quite read. "And what do you suggest I do about that?" "For starters," Grace said, leaning against the doorframe, "talk to him. Really talk to him. Ask him about his day. Show him you care." Ethan let out a bitter chuckle. "I don't have time for that." "That's why you're here." Grace's gaze hardened. "Mr. Cross, you hired me to teach your son, not raise him. That's your job." For a moment, the two of them stood in tense silence. Then Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked tired, almost defeated. "I'm doing the best I can," he said quietly. "I know," Grace said, her voice softening. "But sometimes, the best we can do isn't enough. He needs you, Mr. Cross. More than he needs me." Ethan didn't reply. He just stood there for a moment, staring at the floor, before nodding curtly and leaving. Grace watched him go, her chest tight with a mix of frustration and sympathy. The next morning, Jack greeted Grace with a question that caught her off guard. "Do you like soccer?" he asked as she set up their lesson. "Sure," Grace said, raising an eyebrow. Why? Jack shrugged, his cheeks flushing slightly. I was just wondering. Grace smiled. It wasn't much, but it was something. By the end of the week, they had fallen into a rhythm. Jack's walls were still up, but they were starting to crack. He laughed, albeit reluctantly, when Grace made jokes about fractions and even showed her his favorite soccer jersey during a break. Ethan, meanwhile, kept his distance, watching their progress from afar. But every so often, Grace would catch him lingering in the doorway of the library, his expression unreadable. She knew he was struggling to bridge the gap between himself and his son, and part of her wanted to push him. But she also knew that change couldn't be forced. It had to be earned. The mansion was unusually quiet that evening. The only sounds came from the distant hum of the heating system and the faint rustle of pages as Grace sat at the library table, reviewing Jack's progress. It had been a few weeks since she'd arrived, and while Jack had begun to warm to her, his father remained a puzzle, a man who seemed to have mastered the art of avoidance. Ethan Cross was a constant presence, yet somehow absent. Grace often caught glimpses of him in the early mornings or late evenings, always on a call or engrossed in his laptop. He moved through the house like a shadow, his interactions with Jack brief and transactional. But tonight, fate, or perhaps Grace's growing boldness, would finally bring him into focus. It started at dinner. Grace had taken Jack's suggestion to eat together, a subtle effort to inject warmth into their cold routines. Jack sat at the end of the table, eagerly recounting a story about a soccer game he'd watched on TV. Grace listened attentively, occasionally prompting him with questions, while Ethan silently cut into his steak. So then, Jack said, eyes wide, the goalie dives the wrong way, and the other guy just bam, right into the net. It was awesome. Grace laughed. Sounds like you really know your stuff. Yeah, Jack said, his smile faltering slightly as he glanced at his father. I wish I could play for real. Ethan's head lifted briefly. You have everything you need to play, he said. The equipment, the space. That's not the point, Jack muttered, stabbing a piece of broccoli with his fork. I can't join a team if no one ever takes me to practice. The room fell into an awkward silence. Ethan's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. I'm busy, Jack. You know that. Yeah, I know, Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace set down her fork. You know, she said carefully, there's a park nearby with a soccer league. Maybe we could check it out this weekend? Jack's face lit up. Really? Ethan frowned. Grace, that's not your responsibility. Maybe not, she replied, meeting his gaze evenly. But someone needs to make time for him. Ethan's knife clattered against his plate as he set it down. His blue eyes, usually so composed, flared with something between anger and guilt. I don't appreciate being lectured in my own home. Grace leaned back in her chair, unflinching. And I don't appreciate watching a 10-year-old feel like he's not important. Jack's wide eyes darted between them, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. The tension was thick, the air heavy with unspoken grievances. Finally, Ethan pushed his chair back and stood. This conversation is over, he said coldly, leaving the room. Later that night, Grace found herself sitting in the dimly lit kitchen, nursing a cup of tea. She replayed the dinner scene in her mind, wondering if she had crossed a line. Part of her felt guilty, but a stronger part was resolute. Someone had to say what Jack couldn't. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. He looked less like the intimidating seal she'd met weeks ago, and more like a man who had carried the weight of the world for far too long. Couldn't sleep? She asked, her voice softer now. Ethan hesitated before stepping into the room. I could ask you the same thing. Grace gestured to the chair across from her. Sit. To her surprise, he did. For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. Finally, Ethan spoke. Do you have children, Grace? The question caught her off guard. No, she said. Why? Ethan stared at his hands, his expression unreadable. Then you don't know what it's like to feel like you're failing them. Grace's heart ached at the quiet admission. Maybe not, she said gently, but I do know what it's like to feel invisible. And that's how Jack feels. Ethan looked up sharply, his eyes searching hers. I'm trying, he said, almost defensively. I work hard so he can have everything I didn't. Isn't that enough? Ethan, Grace said, her voice firm but kind, what he needs isn't in your bank account. It's you. Your time, your attention, your belief in him. That's what will make the difference. For a long moment, Ethan didn't respond. Then he let out a weary sigh, leaning back in his chair. I don't know how to be that kind of father. Grace smiled faintly. Start small. Show up. Listen. The rest will come. The next day, Ethan took her advice. He canceled a meeting and drove Jack to the park, much to the boy's shock and delight. Grace watched from the sidelines as Ethan awkwardly kicked a ball around with his son, their laughter echoing through the crisp autumn air. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. Grace couldn't help but smile as she saw the walls between father and son begin to crumble, brick by brick. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. Change was never easy, and the cracks in Ethan's armor were only just starting to show. The first cracks in Ethan's armor had begun to show, but Grace knew better than to celebrate prematurely. Change, especially the kind that Ethan needed, was a slow and painful process. And as much as Jack seemed to thrive in their growing connection, Ethan's old habits weren't so easily shaken. It was a gray Thursday afternoon when Grace encountered the first major test of her patience. She sat in the library, waiting for Jack to arrive for their lesson. The clock ticked loudly, each second stretching into eternity. 5 minutes passed, then 10. With a sigh, Grace left her seat and went in search of him. She found him in the backyard, a soccer ball at his feet. He was practicing penalty shots, his focus entirely on the imaginary game he'd invented. Jack, Grace called from the patio, trying to keep her tone light. Your lesson started 10 minutes ago. Jack didn't look up. I don't want to do math today. Grace crossed her arms, stepping onto the grass. And I don't want to eat spinach. But sometimes we have to do things we don't like. Jack finally looked at her, his expression defiant. It's just one day. Who cares? I care, Grace said firmly. And deep down, you do too. So let's go. Jack glared at her, the soccer ball trapped beneath his foot. For a moment, Grace thought he might argue again. But then he sighed dramatically and followed her inside. The lesson began in a tense silence. Jack slumped in his chair, doodling on the edge of his workbook. Grace tried to remain calm, but his sulky attitude was wearing thin. After 20 minutes of half-hearted effort, she set her pen down and leaned forward. What's going on, Jack? He shrugged, his eyes fixed on the table. Nothing, Jack, Grace said, her voice softening. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. Did something happen? For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, almost inaudibly, he muttered, Dad forgot. Forgot what? Jack's shoulders tensed, and he stared at the page in front of him. He said he'd come to my practice today, but he had a meeting. Like always, Grace felt a pang of sympathy, but she forced herself to stay composed. That must have hurt, she said gently. Jack nodded, his lips pressed tightly together. I don't know why I even thought he'd come. He never does. Grace reached across the table, placing a hand on his. I know it's hard, Jack, but your dad's trying, even if it doesn't always seem like it. Give him a little time. Jack pulled his hand away, shaking his head. He doesn't care. He just pretends to. That evening, Grace waited for Ethan to come home. She heard his car pull into the driveway just as she was finishing up dinner in the guest house. Grabbing her coat, she headed toward the main house, determined to have a conversation with him. She found him in his office, typing furiously on his laptop. He looked up when she entered, his expression a mixture of surprise and irritation. Grace, he said, leaning back in his chair. Is something wrong? Yes, she replied, closing the door behind her. We need to talk about Jack. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. What now? Grace took a seat across from him, her gaze steady. He's upset because you missed his practice today. I had a meeting, Ethan said defensively. It couldn't be helped. Grace raised an eyebrow. Couldn't it? Or was it easier to cancel on him than on your business partners? Ethan's jaw tightened. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. If I don't keep this company running, Jack won't have the opportunities he deserves. And what opportunities will he have if he grows up believing he's not important? Grace countered. Your time is worth more to him than your money, Ethan. Ethan's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, he looked genuinely pained. I'm doing the best I can, he said quietly. Then do better, Grace said, her tone softening. You have a chance to be the father he needs. Don't waste it. The next morning, Ethan surprised both Grace and Jack by joining them for breakfast. He sat at the table, a cup of coffee in one hand and a newspaper in the other, looking more relaxed than Grace had seen him in weeks. Morning, he said, glancing at Jack. Jack looked up from his plate, his expression wary. Morning. Ethan set down his coffee and cleared his throat. I've been thinking, how about we go to the park after school today? Kick the ball around for a bit? Jack's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Really? Really? Ethan said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Unless you don't want to. Jack grinned. I want to. Grace watched the exchange with a mixture of relief and pride. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to Jack. And for once, Ethan seemed to understand that. Later that afternoon, as Ethan and Jack played in the park, Grace sat on a nearby bench, jotting down notes in her planner. She glanced up occasionally, smiling as she watched Jack laugh and shout instructions to his father. But as she watched, a thought nagged at the back of her mind. Ethan was trying, but his efforts were inconsistent. He was still tethered to his work, unable to fully break free. And while Jack seemed happy in the moment, Grace worried about what would happen the next time Ethan got pulled away by a meeting or a crisis. She sighed, closing her planner. Change was never linear. It was messy, full of setbacks and small victories. But as she watched Ethan hoist Jack onto his shoulders, laughing as his son ruffled his hair, she allowed herself a moment of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were on the right path. The days had begun to settle into a rhythm that felt almost natural. Grace noticed the subtle changes in Jack first. His enthusiasm during lessons, the way he began to look forward to outings with his father, and the rare but genuine smiles that lit up his face. Ethan, however, was more difficult to read. He showed up for Jack's soccer games and occasionally joined their dinners, but there was always a part of him that seemed to linger elsewhere, tethered to the relentless demands of his company. One crisp Saturday morning, Grace decided to break the monotony. She proposed an activity that neither Ethan nor Jack had anticipated. Painting? Jack asked, staring at the easel Grace had set up in the backyard. Like, with brushes and stuff? Yes, with brushes and stuff, Grace said with a laugh. It's good for your brain. Helps with focus and creativity. Ethan, standing with his arms crossed a few feet away, arched an eyebrow. I think you've underestimated Jack's ability to turn this into a mess. Messy is fine, Grace replied. She handed Jack a smock and turned to Ethan. You too. Me? Ethan asked, his tone skeptical. Yes, you, Grace said, shoving a smock into his hands. You could use a little creativity yourself. Jack giggled as Ethan reluctantly put on the smock, looking thoroughly out of place. You look like a science teacher, Jack teased. And you look like trouble, Ethan shot back, though his lips twitched in a faint smile. As they began painting, the backyard filled with laughter and the occasional groan of frustration. Jack took to the activity with enthusiasm, splattering colors onto the canvas with abandon. Grace worked alongside him, her strokes measured but vibrant. Ethan, meanwhile, struggled to find his rhythm, muttering under his breath about how painting required more patience than he had. You're holding the brush wrong, Grace said, leaning over to adjust Ethan's grip. I'm holding it just fine, Ethan replied, though he let her guide his hand. I'm just not cut out for this. Don't overthink it, Grace said. It's not about being perfect. It's about expression. Expression, Ethan repeated, his tone dry. Great. I'll express how much I hate this. Jack burst out laughing, nearly knocking over his paint tray. You're terrible, Dad. Thanks for the vote of confidence, Ethan said, shaking his head. But there was a warmth in his voice that Grace hadn't heard before. As the morning wore on, the conversation turned to lighter topics. Grace shared stories from her teaching days, eliciting laughter from Jack and even a chuckle or two from Ethan. When Jack stepped away to grab more paint, Ethan glanced at Grace, his expression thoughtful. "You're good with him," he said quietly. Grace looked up from her canvas. "He's a great kid. Just needed someone to see it." Ethan hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. "I should have seen it sooner." Grace set her brush down, her voice soft but firm. "You're seeing it now. That's what matters." Ethan nodded, though the weight of his guilt was palpable. For a moment, the guarded facade he wore so tightly seemed to crack, revealing the vulnerable man beneath. That afternoon, as they admired their finished paintings, Jack turned to Grace with a grin. "Can we do this again sometime?" "Of course," Grace said, ruffling his hair. "Anytime you want." Jack beamed, his eyes shining with happiness. Grace caught Ethan watching them, his expression a mixture of gratitude and something else she couldn't quite name. "Thanks for this," Ethan said as Jack ran off to play. "I didn't think something so simple could make such a difference." "It's not about the activity," Grace replied. "It's about being present." Ethan nodded slowly, as if the words carried more weight than he wanted to admit. "I'll try to remember that." Later that evening, Ethan surprised Grace with a rare moment of vulnerability. They sat on the patio, the soft glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard. Ethan nursed a glass of whiskey, his posture relaxed but his gaze distant. "I grew up with nothing, you know," he said suddenly. Grace looked at him, her curiosity piqued. "I didn't know that." Ethan swirled the whiskey in his glass, his lips curving into a faint, bitter smile. "My father left when I was 5. My mother worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. We didn't have time for painting or soccer games. Life was about survival." Grace listened intently, sensing this was a story Ethan didn't often share. "When I started CrossIndustries, I promised myself I'd never let Jack feel the way I did growing up," Ethan continued. "But somewhere along the way, I got so focused on building this life for him that I forgot to actually live it with him." "That's not an uncommon mistake," Grace said gently. "But it's never too late to change." Ethan glanced at her, his blue eyes searching hers. "You really believe that?" "I do," Grace said without hesitation. "And I think Jack does too." The next morning, Ethan joined Jack for breakfast without his usual tablet or phone in hand. Instead, he engaged Jack in a conversation about his favorite soccer players, asking questions and genuinely listening to the answers. Grace watched from the kitchen doorway, a small smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't a grand gesture or a sweeping transformation, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start was all that mattered. The mansion felt different these days. There was a warmth creeping into its corners, like the first hints of spring after a long winter. Jack, once perpetually sullen and withdrawn, now carried an air of quiet confidence. His laughter rang out more often, echoing through the hallways as he practiced soccer drills in the backyard or helped Grace in the kitchen. Ethan, too, had begun to change in ways both subtle and profound. It was during one of their evening dinners that Grace first noticed the shift in Ethan. He was no longer glued to his phone, his plate half empty as he responded to urgent emails. Instead, he was engaged, asking Jack about school, teasing him about his messy hair, and even cracking the occasional dry joke. "So," Ethan said, leaning back in his chair one evening, "how's the soccer league coming along?" Jack grinned. "Coach says I'm getting better. I almost scored last time." "Almost, huh?" Ethan teased, raising an eyebrow. "What stopped you?" Jack shrugged, his face lighting up with the kind of enthusiasm Grace had come to cherish. "The goalie's huge, Dad. Like, twice my size. Sounds like you need to practice your angles," Ethan said with a small smile. "We'll work on it this weekend." Jack's eyes widened. "You mean it?" "Of course," Ethan said, his tone steady. "We'll make a day of it." Grace watched the exchange with a quiet sense of satisfaction. This was the Ethan she had glimpsed in moments of vulnerability. A father who cared deeply, even if he didn't always know how to show it. The next weekend, Ethan and Jack spent hours at the park, practicing shots and dribbles while Grace sat on a nearby bench, reading. The sight of them together, a father and son bridging a gap that had once felt insurmountable, brought a lump to her throat. "Good shot," Ethan called out as Jack's ball sailed past the makeshift goalpost. "Thanks, Dad," Jack shouted back, his face flushed with pride. Later, as they walked back to the car, Jack turned to Grace. "Can we stop for ice cream?" Grace smiled. "I don't see why not." Ethan chuckled. "Let's make it a tradition. Practice an ice cream every weekend." Jack beamed, his excitement contagious. "Really? Really?" Ethan said, ruffling his son's hair. "You've earned it." As the weeks passed, Ethan's transformation extended beyond his relationship with Jack. Grace noticed subtle changes in his approach to work as well. He no longer stayed holed up in his office for hours on end, nor did he take every call labeled urgent. He delegated more, trusting his team to handle the day-to-day operations of cross industries, and carved out time for the things that truly mattered. One afternoon, Grace caught him walking through the house with a large box in his hands. Curious, she followed him to the dining room, where he began unpacking stacks of books and folders. "What's all this?" she asked, leaning against the doorway. Ethan glanced up, his expression unusually light. "Some old stuff from my parents' house. Thought I'd go through it with Jack." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Memory lane?" "Something like that," Ethan said, pulling out a faded photograph of a boy sitting on a rusted bicycle. "That's me. First bike my mom bought me." Grace smiled, stepping closer to study the photo. "You look so proud." "I was," Ethan said, a hint of nostalgia creeping into his voice. "Took me 2 summers of mowing lawns to save up for the repairs, but it was worth it." Jack appeared in the doorway, his eyes lighting up at the sight of the old photos. "What's that?" "Just some memories," Ethan said, beckoning him over. "Want to help me sort through them?" Jack nodded eagerly, pulling up a chair. Together, they sifted through the contents of the box, laughing at the faded photos and marveling at the dusty trophies Ethan had won as a kid. "Dad," Jack said, holding up a medal, "you were good at soccer?" Ethan chuckled. "Not as good as you're going to be." Grace watched the scene unfold, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and hope. The walls that had once separated Ethan and Jack were coming down, brick by brick, and the bond they were building felt unshakable. One evening, as Grace prepared to leave the guest house for the night, Ethan knocked on her door. He held a folder in one hand, his expression thoughtful. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Of course," Grace said, stepping aside to let him in. Ethan placed the folder on the kitchen counter and opened it, revealing a series of documents. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, that Jack needs more than just material things." Grace nodded, unsure where he was going with this. "I've started looking into ways to give back," Ethan continued, "to create something meaningful. And I wanted your opinion." He slid one of the papers toward her. It was a proposal for a foundation dedicated to supporting children in need, providing education, mentorship, and resources to help them thrive. Grace's breath caught as she read through the details. "This is incredible, Ethan. It's just an idea for now," he said, his voice almost shy. "But it feels right." Grace looked up at him, her eyes shining. "It is right. And I think it's exactly what Jack would be proud of." Ethan's lips curved into a small, genuine smile. "Thanks for everything." Grace returned the smile, feeling a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced in years. She had come to this house expecting to teach a boy fractions and grammar. Instead, she had witnessed, and been a part of, a transformation that went far deeper. The days at the Cross Mansion had taken on a kind of warmth Grace hadn't thought possible when she first arrived. Jack was thriving, confident, happy, and deeply bonded with his father. Ethan, too, had changed in ways that left Grace quietly astonished. He no longer carried the same cold detachment, the impenetrable armor of a man consumed by his work. Instead, he moved through life with purpose, attentive to his son and the world around him. But even as things improved, Grace knew her time with the Cross family was drawing to a close. She had always intended this to be temporary, a stepping stone toward rebuilding her own life. And now, it seemed, that moment had come. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Grace made her decision. She sat on the patio of the guest house, sipping her tea and watching the sunrise. The garden, with its carefully trimmed hedges and bursts of color, felt like a metaphor for the family she had helped nurture. But gardens needed tending, and it was time for her to move on. Later that day, she called Jack and Ethan into the living room. Jack bounded in first, his face alight with curiosity. Ethan followed, his expression cautious. "What's up?" Jack asked, flopping onto the couch. Grace took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I wanted to talk to you both. I think it's time for me to go." The room fell silent. Jack's smile faded, replaced by a look of confusion. "What do you mean? Go where?" "I've been here for months," Grace said gently, "and I've loved every moment of it. But I think you're ready to continue on your own." Jack shook his head vehemently. "No way. You can't leave." Ethan's gaze was fixed on her, his blue eyes unreadable. "Grace, are you sure about this?" "I am," she said, though the words felt heavy. "You and Jack have come so far. You don't need me anymore." Jack's eyes filled with tears. "But I do need you." Grace moved to sit beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "Jack, you're stronger than you think. And you have your dad now. The two of you are a team." Jack sniffled, leaning into her embrace. "It won't be the same." "No," Grace agreed, her voice soft. "But it'll be good. Better than good." Ethan cleared his throat, his expression unusually vulnerable. "Grace, I can't thank you enough for what you've done. You've given us more than I ever thought possible." Grace smiled at him, her eyes glistening. "You gave it to yourselves, Ethan. I just helped you see it." The next few days were filled with goodbyes. Jack insisted on helping Grace pack, slipping small notes into her suitcase when he thought she wasn't looking. Ethan, true to form, stayed composed, though Grace could sense the weight of his emotions in the quiet moments they shared. On her final evening, they gathered in the dining room for one last meal together. Jack presented her with a card he had made, complete with a drawing of a soccer field and a stick figure labeled Ms. Grace holding a book. "It's perfect," Grace said, her voice catching as she hugged him tightly. Ethan raised his glass, his voice steady but warm. "To Grace, for showing us what really matters." They clinked glasses, the moment bittersweet but full of gratitude. The morning of her departure dawned bright and clear. Ethan drove her to the train station, while Jack sat quietly in the back seat, holding onto her hand as if letting go would make her disappear. When they arrived, Ethan carried her suitcase onto the platform, his usual stoic expression tinged with something softer. "You're always welcome here," he said, his voice low. "Don't forget that." Grace nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She knelt down to hug Jack one last time, whispering words of encouragement and love into his ear. He clung to her fiercely before finally letting go. As the train pulled away, Grace watched them through the window, her heart heavy but full. She knew she had left a piece of herself with them, but she also knew they were ready to stand on their own. Weeks later, Grace received a letter in the mail. It was from Ethan, written in his neat, precise handwriting. He described the changes they had made, how he and Jack spent weekends volunteering at the shelter Grace had once worked at, how Jack was excelling in school, and how they were preparing to launch the foundation they had discussed. At the bottom of the letter, Ethan had written a simple but profound message. "Thank you for giving us back our lives. We'll never forget you." Grace folded the letter carefully, a small smile playing on her lips. She had come into their lives as a tutor, but she had left as something far more important. She had shown them how to love, to hope, and to believe in each other. And in doing so, she had found those things for herself too.